once was at a meeting where I heard Carl say something to the extent of, we don't know what other people feel. In fact, most of the time, we don't even really know how we feel. And while that statement was meant to report several different things about the way that the brain works and emotions, etc., one of the things that he was emphasizing, and I know he was emphasizing it because he confirmed this for me, was the fact that language, things like the word happiness or joy or meaning or pleasure or delight, are actually not very precise when it comes to describing our brain and body states. So for instance, if I tell you I'm feeling pretty happy, I know what that means for me, at least in this moment, but you don't really know whether or not it means the same thing as what pretty happy means for you. If I say I'm extremely happy and I have a big grin, I have a grin on my face that I can't seem to wipe off my face, well, then you might get a sense of how much happier I am than pretty happy, but it's still hard to calibrate my level of internal state or happiness. And the same is true for you and for everybody else. And it's important for us to acknowledge this because at this point in human history, 2022, we don't really have a measurement like body temperature or heart rate variability, or even a way to measure neurochemicals in the brain and body that give us anything better than a crude correlate or an estimate at best of what happiness is. So that's really important to understand and to keep in mind throughout this episode. It doesn't mean that we cannot have a strong data-driven conversation about happiness and what brings us to a state of happiness, but it's very important to understand that language is not an ideal and maybe even a deficient tool in terms of describing our emotions and our states of mind and body. Now, equally important is to understand that while we do have neurotransmitters, that is the chemicals that are released between neurons, nerve cells that allow neurons to communicate, things like glutamate and GABA, for instance, and we have what are called neuromodulators. These are chemicals also released by neurons that impact the electrical firing and chemical release of other neurons, things like serotonin and dopamine and acetylcholine and epinephrine. Neuromodulators and neurotransmitters are always present in a cocktail in our brain and body. That is, they are present in different ratios and at different levels. So we need to completely discard with the idea that any one neurotransmitter or any one neuromodulator is solely responsible for a state of happiness, or for a lack of state of happiness for that matter. That said, it is true that for people that tend to have lower baseline levels of, for instance, dopamine, their levels of happiness, or we should say their self-reported levels of happiness, tend to be lower than for those that have greatly elevated baseline levels of dopamine. Now, this can be best appreciated at the extremes, where, for instance, in conditions like Parkinson's disease or other conditions where people's levels of dopamine in their brain is severely depleted. Mind you, we also see this in drug-addicted individuals that are in a withdrawal state because they're trying to quit or they don't have access to the drug that normally stimulates release of dopamine. Think the cocaine addict who can't get cocaine, or the methamphetamine addict that can't or is trying to avoid taking methamphetamine, or the Parkinson's patient who has fewer dopamine neurons because they degenerated. Those individuals do tend to be more depressed. They tend to have lower affect. They are less happy. At least that's how they report themselves to be emotionally. And that's what we observe when we look at them behaviorally in terms of the amount of smiling, the amount of energy they seem to have. At the opposite extreme, and while still focusing on the kind of pathology of neurotransmitter and neuromodulator systems, an individual who is in a manic phase of bipolar will tend to have very elevated levels of dopamine. And those people will talk a mile a minute and they won't require sleep. And at least to them, every idea is an exciting idea and one that they want to pursue. We did an entire episode about bipolar depression, aka bipolar disorder. So if you'd like to learn more about that, please check out that episode. That and all other episodes of the podcast, of course, you can find at hubermanlab.com in all formats. But the point here is that very low levels or very high levels of dopamine are correlated with certain states of, for instance, low happiness or the absence of happiness. We could even call it depression in some cases, or extreme happiness or even euphoria, sometimes even inappropriate euphoria, as is the case with bipolar. depression, or is it sometimes called bipolar mania or bipolar disorder. Now, of course, there's a range in between depressed and manic, and most people, fortunately, reside somewhere in that range. And it is indeed a continuum. And I think it's safe to say that levels of dopamine probably do correlate with levels of happiness. But there is no one single chemical nor chemical signature that is no specific recipe of, 2 parts dopamine to 1 part serotonin to 1 part acetylcholine that we can say equates to happiness. Indeed, there's now tremendous controversy as to whether or not, for instance, having lower levels of serotonin is actually the cause of depression or merely correlates with depression, or maybe doesn't even correlate with depression at all. This became especially controversial because in the last year, the so-called serotonin hypothesis of depression has been called into question. And indeed, it does seem to be the case that for individuals that are depressed, their levels of serotonin can sometimes be normal. However, and this is an important however, that does not mean that administering drugs that increase levels of serotonin in depressed people does not sometimes, and indeed often, help ameliorate some of their symptoms. And I should mention that many of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so-called SSRIs, such as Prozac and Zoloft, etc., are still considered excellent treatments for conditions like OCD and so on and so forth. But what I'm trying to do is make 2 important points. First of all, that language is not a great indicator of internal state, especially when trying to understand other people's internal state. And that is especially true for things like happiness, and that there is no one chemical signature of happiness. There's no one neuromodulator or combinations of neuromodulators that we can say is the cocktail for happiness. But, and it's a very important but, when levels of dopamine and serotonin tend to be chronically low for an individual, below their typical baseline, they will, yes, tend to be lower in affect and have lower mood and less episodes of happiness per day, per week, per month, per year, etc. Conversely, when an individual has elevations in dopamine and serotonin levels, in particular dopamine levels, and the other so-called catecholamines, which include epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the catecholamines are dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. They're all very similar biochemically. They all lead to states of elevated motivation, energy, and so on. When those chemicals are elevated above baseline, people do tend to have elevated sense of mood and well-being, and in particular, sense of possibility about what they can do in the world and what the world can offer them.